Hello, everyone. So, apparently, Ben Shapiro made this new show called Debunked, where he debunks, or at the very least, he certainly tries to debunk a common leftist myth in 15 minutes or less every episode. Um, I guess most of the show is paywalled. You have to buy a Daily Wire membership in order to access it. But they decided to upload this video as a sort of advertisement, I guess. Um, in this episode, Ben Shapiro is going to be talking about transgender ideology. In other words, trans people are requesting that they be treated with very basic amounts of respect and human dignity, and this is very problematic for Ben Shapiro. He's very upset that a group of people have politicized the issue of their own human rights. So let's just go ahead and get into it.
Today on Debunked, we're going to discuss a very common question. Can a man be a woman?
Alright, so less than like 3 seconds into the video, and we already have an aggressively false framing of the issue at hand from Ben Shapiro. So the reason this is false framing is because the claim being made by people who argue for the validity of transness, I guess, is not that trans women are somehow men and women at the same time, or that trans men are somehow men and women at the same time. The claim, rather, is that trans women are women and not men, and that trans men are men and not women. So why he would try to frame this as can a man be a woman is very strange to me. But I guess to address the more substantive point, which is, does it make sense to say that trans women are women, and does it make sense to say that trans men are men? And I guess in order to ask the question, are trans women women, we have to ask the question, how do we define woman? And in order to do that, we have to ask the question, how do we determine the correct definition of a word, which leads us to the question of what even are words, right? So I'm going to try and build up my argument from that very fundamental level. The first thing that I want to get out of the way is that words are simply constructs that human beings create for the purposes of our own utility. I feel like this is relatively non-controversial. There is no book that was dropped from heaven that tells us what all of the right words are, and what all of the right definitions for words are. There is no alternative dimension that we can tap into that tells us what all of the correct words are and what all of the correct definitions for words are. Words are just human beings saying, we are going to use a certain mouth noise to refer to a certain concept in the world, because doing so allows us to communicate more efficiently and allows us to create more cohesive and efficient social structures, which we ultimately derive some utility from. And then the next question, in terms of how do we determine the correct definition of a word? And I think it follows from what I just laid out that you really can't. In order for something to be correct or incorrect, it has to be a claim about the world. It has to be a proposition. So, for example, if I said the sky is red, and what I clarify that when I say red, I mean like the color that we all experience when we talk about the color red, right? Like the color that exists on the outside of a Coke can, for example. And then we can look up at the sky and we can see that, in fact, the sky is not red. In fact, the sky is blue. Then I have made an active claim about the world that does not align with what we can observe in reality. But because a definition is not a claim about reality or a proposition, then a definition, by definition, cannot be true or false. It just doesn't make sense to say that. So if a definition can't be true or false, then what do we mean when we talk about what is the right definition of a word? Well, this goes back to what I said earlier, which is that words are simply constructs that we create for the purposes of our own utility. And it follows from that that the only coherent way to conceptualize what is the right definition for a word is by talking in terms of which definition of a word provides us with the most utility. Now, to bring this back to the trans issue, I would argue that because we know that trans people are people who often suffer a great deal psychologically because they feel as though society is not recognizing them as the gender that they identify with, it therefore provides us with more utility to use the term woman in a way which is inclusive of trans women, and to use a definition of man which is inclusive of trans men. Because doing so recognizes trans people as the gender they identify with and reduces unnecessary human suffering. Yeah, that's my basic argument for why trans women are women and trans men are men. Let's see if Ben Shapiro can lay out a substantive counterargument to anything that I just said.
Dr. Levine, do you believe that minors are capable of making such a life-changing decision as changing one's sex?
Well, Senator, thank you for your interest in this question. Transgender medicine is a very complex and nuanced field.
The specific question was about minors. Let's be a little more specific since you evaded the question. Do you support the government intervening to override the parent's consent to give a child puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and/or amputation surgery of breasts and genitalia?
Senator, transgender medicine is a very complex...
The answer, clearly, is yes, as Levine even told a former Trump administration official. Just pause on that for a moment and think about how crazy that is.
I don't know whether or not Ben Shapiro is misrepresenting the person he's talking about, because I'm not familiar with this person's positions, and I'm not going to research it for the purposes of this video. But he could be misrepresenting her, I don't know.
Now, in the past few years, you've heard a lot of statements that sound like we must not raise boys as boys and girls as girls, because we just can't be sure that kids actually have the sex assigned to them at birth.
So this is going to sound super nitpicky, but fuck it. I'll be nitpicky because Ben Shapiro tries to frame himself as some sort of, like, expert intellectual. But these slip-ups in terminology kind of show that he has a very fundamental misunderstanding of the sort of basic subject matter that we're talking about. So the claim isn't that we shouldn't raise kids in gendered ways because we don't know whether or not they have the sex assigned to them at birth. That statement doesn't make any sense. The claim, rather, is that we shouldn't raise kids in gendered ways because we don't know if, as they get older, the gender that they choose to identify with and express themselves as will coincide with the sex assigned to them at birth. That is the claim, which is a very different claim.
You've heard that some people are men in women's bodies, or women in men's bodies.
So Ben Shapiro actually isn't strawmanning here. I have heard a lot of people use this narrative that trans women are women in men's bodies and vice versa for trans men. I actually do disagree with this way of thinking. I agree with something that ContraPoint said in one of her videos, which is that this is more of like a sort of feel-good way of talking about the issue rather than an actual, like, intellectually defensible analysis of what being trans consists of. But I'll get more into this later because Ben Shapiro brings this up again.
You may even have heard that if you're a straight dude and you don't want to have sex with a trans woman, meaning a biological male, this makes you gay.
I don't know who the fuck is saying that, but okay, moving on.
All of this is insane, patent nonsense. Males and females reproduce with one another in the human species. We've known this for quite a while.
Wait. Before he gets into his argument.
Nonsense.
Alright, so the title card here is The Two Sexes. So this section is going to be about whether or not sex is binary. And before I get into his arguments, I want to talk a little bit about this. The first thing that I want to talk about is why this matters and also why this kind of doesn't really matter. So whether or not sex is binary matters in the sense that Ben is trying to create these categories of man and woman and create these definitions for man and woman based on his model of sex. So whether or not his model of sex is sound determines whether or not the claims he makes about the categories of man and woman and the definitions he tries to derive from that model are also sound. So Is sex binary? Well, the obvious answer is no. Sex is bimodal. Binary means that there are only two possible outcomes with respect to a certain variable. So, for example, if you've ever seen binary code, there are ones and there are zeros. There are two letters. As soon as there is a third letter, if you see a 2 somewhere in the binary code, then it is no longer a binary code. It is some other kind of code that I can't remember the name of. And it doesn't matter how rare it is. Even if it's a million ones and twos, or a million ones and zeros, and then there's a single 2 at the bottom, right? As soon as there are more than two possible outcomes with respect to a certain variable, we are no longer talking about a binary. Sex is bimodal, meaning a bimodal distribution is a distribution wherein outcomes tend to gravitate towards two general areas and cluster around two general areas, but there's also a degree of non-correspondence with those general two areas. There's a degree of fuzziness or grayness somewhere in the middle. The reason we know that sex is bimodal rather than binary is because scientists analyze biological sex using a bunch of different sex categories, right? So they analyze sex using chromosomal sex, hormonal sex, primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics, gametes, etc. And the important thing to note is, first of all, none of these categories, even on their own, are binary. None of these categories on their own are capable of unassailably placing every human being into one of two sex categories. So, for example, if we want to talk about chromosomes, right? Most people have XX or XY chromosomes, but some people have XXY chromosomes, for example, or some other variation. If we want to talk about hormonal sex, some women have more estrogen than other women, some men have more testosterone than other men, so even that's sort of on a spectrum. If we want to talk about gametes, even with regards to gametes, most people either produce sperm or egg, but some people produce both, and therefore it's not a binary. Obviously, when we're talking about something like sex characteristics, those possible outcomes exist on a wide spectrum. Some women have larger breasts than other women, etc. So besides the fact that none of these categories on their own are binary, these various different layers can also conflict with one another. So, for example, you can have male primary sex characteristics and female secondary sex characteristics. You can have XX chromosomes, but also have a completely otherwise male phenotype. There's a bunch of different ways in which these different layers can conflict with one another. And so, since we know that sex is bimodal for this reason, we know that Ben's claims about the categories of male and female start to fall apart. So, for example, Ben Shapiro wants to make the claim that trans women are biological males, right? But is this really true? No, not really. Because if we're talking with regards to hormonal sex, if you're a trans woman on HRT, congrats, you are a biological female with regards to your hormonal sex. If you are a trans woman and you have bottom surgery, you are a biological female with regards to your primary sex characteristics. If you have top surgery, then you're a biological female with regards to your secondary sex characteristics. And this sort of fuzziness, this grayness, this level of nuance in these sorts of categories are specifically why there is a growing academic consensus that a more accurate model of sex evaluates sex in terms of, or with respect to individual layers of sex, rather than trying to classify entire organisms into one of two sex categories. And so, because the model of sex which Ben Shapiro appeals to is not descriptively accurate, his entire argument falls apart, right? Once we have an understanding of sex which is more in line with the empirical research and the existing academic consensus, we understand that he can't try to construct these categories based on biological sex. But I also want to talk really quickly, because I explained why this is relevant, but I also want to talk about why it's not really relevant. So even if sex was binary, it doesn't follow from that we ought to define woman based on sex rather than based on gender identity and gender expression, right? I could concede this entire section of the video and say, fine, Ben Shapiro, sex is binary, but still make the argument that I made earlier and say that we should still define woman based on gender rather than sex, because doing so provides us with more utility, and which definition provides us with more utility is the only coherent way to conceptualize what's the right definition. So let's see what Ben has to say about this.
Males and females reproduce with one another in the human species. We've known this for quite a while. The simple reality is that the human species is sexually dimorphic. Sex is binary. We come in two brands, male and female. Typically, those who have the XY chromosomes are male. Those who have XX chromosomes are female.
All right, so Ben Shapiro wants to define sex purely based on chromosomes. I'm going to try and speedrun this section because I already alluded to some of the counter-arguments to this earlier. But the three basic problems with this. One, scientists do not classify sex purely based on hormones. There is a wide variety of other layers of sex that scientists use to classify sex, and therefore to say that it's purely based on chromosomes is to use a reductive definition of sex. Two, even if we wanted to talk about chromosomes as the sole definer of one's sex, even the distribution of chromosomes among human populations are not binary, right? So, like I said earlier, some people have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, or most people have XX or XY chromosomes, but some people, a lot of people, have some other variation, like XXY chromosomes. Thirdly, if we wanted to define sex solely based on chromosomes, we run into certain reductios. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, a reductio just means that certain premises that somebody has subscribed to necessarily entail certain conclusions that they wouldn't want to accept, which goes to show that their premises probably aren't valid. And so when I'm talking about this issue specifically, what I mean is that if we were to say that everyone with XX chromosomes is a woman and everyone with XY chromosomes is a man, then that would mean that somebody who has XX chromosomes but an otherwise completely male phenotype, meaning they have a penis, they have testicles, they have a flat chest, they have testosterone, they can even produce sperm and become a father, this person, by this definition, would be a woman. But that obviously doesn't make sense. That's obviously absurd. And what's funny is conservatives always try to say, like, oh, the left is so crazy, they think men can give birth. But that's actually the kind of conclusion that would follow from the definition that Ben Shapiro is laying out here. It's just kind of funny.
Males and females differ. They differ in size and shape, and musculature, brain function. As neuroscientist Steven Pinker says, differences between the sexes are part of the human condition. There are certainly people who have anomalous genetic conditions, like Klinefelter syndrome, in which a person has two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, and in whom breast development looks female while male genitalia are present. Overall, disorders of sexual development affect 1 in every 5,000 births. Now, the presence of abnormal development does not mean that sex is a spectrum.
Okay, so two problems with what he just said. The first problem is that earlier he said that sex is binary. So what he's saying is that just because there are outliers, that doesn't mean that sex isn't binary. But the problem is that it just very technically does, right? In order for something to be binary, there has to be only two possible outcomes. As soon as there are other possible outcomes, no matter how rare, we're no longer talking about a binary. This is why you do not see binary code with ones and zeros and then the occasional 2 every 1 in 5,000 words or numbers. The second problem with this is that he is trying to provide a stat of, hey, look how rare it is that the sexual binary is negated. But the problem is that that stat does not take into account all of the possible ways in which the sexual binary can be negated. because that was specifically looking at births, and a lot of the layers of biological sex do not develop in human beings until well after birth. For example, our hormonal sex does not develop until well after birth. Our primary and secondary sex characteristics can be changed throughout our lives. And so, so that was just a misusage of statistics on his part. All right.
To suggest otherwise, it would be the same thing as saying that because one child every few thousand is born with 3 toes, this means that the number of toes in the human being is a spectrum. Or that a person with 3 toes might actually be a sloth human, a 3-toed sloth human.
So this is just such a stupid fucking argument. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But so problem number 1, he says, would it mean that the amount of toes people can have is a spectrum because sometimes people are born with an abnormal amount of toes? I don't know the answer to that, but the problem is that when we're talking about a spectrum is just defined in terms of there are a wide variety of possible outcomes with respect to a certain variable. Now, what constitutes a wide variety of outcomes is completely arbitrary and is just arbitrarily decided by scientists in different fields. Whether or not people in the medical field would consider the amount of variation in how many toes a person can have to be wide enough to be a spectrum, I don't know. That's up for them to decide, I guess. What we could say is that the amount of toes a person can have is not a binary. It's not like you can only have 10 toes or 0 toes, right? There are people who have different amounts of toes besides just those 2 options. So yes, the amount of toes people have aren't a binary, definitionally. Another problem with this is that when we're talking about the definition of a spectrum, like I said earlier, it's just defined as a wide variety of possible outcomes. And in this respect, sex is disanalogous to the amount of toes people can have because the degree of possible variance with regards to somebody's sex is more wide-ranging than the degree of variance with respect to how many toes people can be observed having. Another problem, the sloth thing just didn't really make any sense because he's saying like, oh, well, just because you have 3 toes doesn't mean you're a sloth. It's like, no shit. Because the fallacy there would be just because you share a certain physical attribute with another thing doesn't mean that you are equivalent to or identical to that thing. But there is no similar fallacy being committed by people who say that sex is bimodal. The only claim there is that because we can observe more than 2 possible outcomes with respect to sex, it is not a binary. And he has not made a substantive counterargument to that position.
All reproduction is rooted in the presence of sexual dimorphism.
All right, so the claim that reproduction requires a sexual binary is just not really true. Reproduction requires that some people have the ability to produce sperm and some people have the ability to produce eggs, but this is a very different claim than sex is binary, right? Because for one, there are more layers to sex than just gametes. And additionally, even if we wanted to talk about gametes, some people, even that's not a binary because some people can produce both sperm and eggs, right?
To pretend otherwise is biologically nonsensical. That's why, to end a conversation on transgenderism, just ask for a simple, non-self-referential definition of the terms man and woman. When I say non-self-referential, I mean you can't say, I feel like a woman, therefore I am a woman.
All right, so Ben Shapiro wants a non-self-referential definition of the term woman, so I will give him one. A woman is someone whose gender is woman. Gender is defined in terms of 1, the totality of one's social expressions, the average reasonable person's interpretation of those expressions, and the average reasonable person's categorization of one based on those interpretations, and 2, the totality of one's internal inclinations which lead to making those expressions. That's a pretty concrete, pretty non-self-referential definition of the term woman that I just provided, which is inclusive of trans women. So I guess Ben Shapiro can become a trans-positive conservative now, since I've given him what he wants.
For advocates of biology, the answer for what is woman or what is man is simple. You can look at chromosomes, SRY genes, reproductive systems, verifiable answers to the question. For advocates of the position that some biological men are women, or vice versa, there is no standard that can be applied.
Right, so the problems with the two things he just said there are that, for one, he wants to appeal to biology, but his model of biological sex is incorrect, so his entire argument falls apart. And a more accurate model does not try to categorize entire organisms into categories like male and female. And two, we do have a standard which is inclusive of trans people, or a definition that's inclusive of trans people which has a standard, right? I referred earlier to a definition which includes the totality of one's social expressions and people's interpretations of those social expressions, as well as the totality of one's internal inclinations which lead to them making those social expressions, right? So that is a standard that we can look at. Now, it is a standard which appeals to certain things which are socially constructed, but just because it appeals to certain things which are socially constructed doesn't mean that it's not a standard or a valid standard.
A man can become a woman or a woman a man at any time without any stable definition of man or woman whatsoever.
All right, so all right, so this just doesn't make any sense. So the idea that because by my definition, someone who was once considered a man can become a woman, therefore definitions of man and woman aren't stable, that just doesn't logically follow. So for example, I have a wooden chair somewhere in my house. Now, I could go and get that chair and deconstruct it and turn it into a bench, such that something which was once a chair has now become a bench. Now, does the fact that that was possible mean that we do not have a stable definition of a bench and a chair? Of course not. That's absurd.
Any time without any stable definition of man or woman whatsoever. So according to our pseudo-medical activists, gender identity is completely separate from sex. The separation between gender and sex relies on a simple fallacy: that gender is entirely socially constructed and thus separate from biology.
So this part was really funny to me because if you listen closely to what he just said, what he said is that the notion that gender is different from sex relies on the fallacy that gender is different than sex, right? So this is what's called a question-begging argument. A question-begging argument occurs when someone is trying to make an argument in order to reach a certain conclusion, but they smuggle that conclusion in as a premise of their argument such that they haven't actually made an argument for their position. They've just asserted their conclusion twice, which is exactly what Ben just did. So this isn't a valid argument. But I guess to address the underlying point about whether or not it's valid to make a distinction between gender and sex, I want to give a reminder that, as I said earlier, a definition of something, therefore a definition of gender, can't be wrong, but the only way to classify what's the right way to define a given word is based on utility. So do we get more utility out of recognizing a distinction, a definitional distinction between gender and sex? Well, I would argue that we do. For one, because there is simply an academic consensus that gender is a distinguishable concept or a distinct concept from sex, and that woman can refer to the former rather than the latter concept. So if we want to talk about academic organizations that recognize a distinction between gender and sex, we can talk about the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Sociological Association, the American Psychoanalytic Association, the World Health Organization, Britain's National Health Service. The list goes on and on. This is academic consensus. And I think that we don't gain any utility. In fact, we lose utility by stubbornly deciding to define certain concepts in ways which are contradictory to the way in which all of academia is talking about and analyzing certain concepts. even if you want to talk about how academia is full of like child eating pedophiles or some shit like that, we can even look at like more colloquial definitions. So for example, the dictionary is a source which tells us more colloquial definitions of certain things as opposed to, academic definitions. And even if you look up the dictionary definition of gender, it clarifies that it is talking about more cultural concepts as opposed to sex, which refers to biological concepts. Another argument that I could make to this effect is that we actually get important theoretical clarification from making a distinction between the concepts of gender and sex. So, for example, we know that gender norms and gender roles can differ massively across different societies, even though we're not biologically different from one another. Even within societies, gender roles can change massively over time, right? So in the United States, the sorts of roles and narratives and expectations that we have around women have shifted massively in recent years compared to what they used to be. But that's not because our biology shifted, right? Our biological sex has been constant, but gender norms have shifted, which tends to tell us that in order to properly understand things, there is a valid distinction to be made between people's biological sex characteristics and the sorts of cultural roles and expectations and identity constructs that that societies often attach to those biological sexes.
Gender in this iteration would be all the various feminine qualities that adhere to womanhood, or the masculine qualities that adhere to being a male. According to these folks, gender and sex are completely different. Right? All of those gendered notions of femininity, they're completely separate from being a biological female. This Cartesian notion that you can be a woman in a man's body, a soul in the machine, because your gender is separate from your sex, is utterly unsupportable at any level.
All right, so he's arguing against the validity of transness by saying that to say that a woman is or a trans woman is a woman in a man's body is unsupportable. I actually agree with that, right? I don't believe in this sort of weird essentialism where we have souls trapped in other bodies or whatever. I don't think that a trans woman is a woman trapped in a man's body. I think that a trans woman is a person who was assigned male at birth who possesses internal inclinations to express their gender as a woman. And because there's no harm in doing that, and in fact people are harmed when we don't recognize that, we ought to recognize that. So yeah, I actually agree with him here, but I don't think that it follows that just because trans women aren't women trapped in men's bodies, that doesn't mean that there aren't valid arguments explaining the validity of being trans.
Everyone understands there are some attributes that are generally considered more masculine. Chopping wood, being dumb.
I'm whizzing with the
Jesus, the fucking casual misandry from Ben here.
door open, and I love it.
And some that are considered more feminine. Being caring, being nice, right? These are distinctions
I like how Ben Shapiro is just making the case for toxic masculinity here.
that do appear in virtually all cultures. Some of that is undoubtedly biologically oriented, and some is undoubtedly social construction.
That's true. I don't disagree with that. But the claim is that, so he's making the point that like there are certain biological factors which can influence the sort of gender roles that people have, right? So like maybe we consider that, or we have a gender role that says women are in general X thing because women actually do possess some underlying biological quality that makes them more likely to be X thing. And I actually agree that there are some, like there is some validity to that idea, but it doesn't, so that would be a valid argument if somebody said that gender and sex are concepts which do not in any way overlap with one another. But that's not the claim. The claim isn't that gender and sex don't overlap with each other sometimes. The claim is that they are distinct concepts. such that it is possible to have a gender that does not align with your sex. And this certainly isn't a valid argument against that position.
But it is simply ridiculous to suggest that if a boy is effeminate, he's actually a girl, or that if a girl is masculine, she might actually be a boy.
So the problem is that this is just a straw man, right? I'm not saying that the position is not that if a boy possesses any feminine qualities, that is sufficient to categorize him as a woman, right? There can be more feminine boys. The claim is that in order to be like a woman, the way we're defining woman takes into account the totality of one's social expressions and people's interpretations of them and one's internal inclinations, which is very different than just, oh, you displayed some feminine qualities, therefore you're a woman. So this just seems like a straw man.
But this is what gender theorists are.
Wow, add, base.
Argue. The origins of the gender identity movement lie with a professor of medical psychology at Johns Hopkins in the 1960s. His name was John Money. After twin boys were born, and after a botched circumcision destroyed one boy's penis, that boy was raised as a girl. By the time that boy was a teenager, the boy felt extraordinary discomfort because he was biologically male, and his parents told him the truth. Both twins ended up killing themselves in their mid-30s.
Jesus, maybe we shouldn't do circumcision then, Ben.
That didn't stop John Money from founding the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1965. His theory was children could identify as members of the opposite sex, and that radical surgery was the proper solution. That inside, these kids were members of the opposite sex in reality, and that surgery would merely make their bodies align with their identity. Money claims that, quote, the gender identity gate is open at birth for a normal child, no less than for one born with unfinished sex organs, and would stay that way for at least a year. So in other words, you could have a full biological boy with finished sex organs, and his gender identity was still open. Brains and body.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is just empirically true. We see that there are people who have completely finished sex organs who are born as normal, healthy, biological males who then, as they grow up, decide that the gender identity, their gender identity and preferred gender expression does not match that assignment they were given at birth, right? I mean, this is just empirically true, right?
Bodies were considered in direct opposition, completely separate from one another. Radical feminists, like Judith Butler, began arguing that all gender was socially constructed, and that therefore all inequalities in outcome between men and women could be laid at the feet of an evil, sexist society.
I've never actually read Judith Butler, so I don't know if Ben Shapiro is misrepresenting.
If gender is a meaningless social construct created by society, why does it matter more than sex, which is actual real biology? And why is gender more real than biology itself?
Right, so this just seems like another straw man. So nobody's saying that gender matters more than sex. I don't even know what that means. Like, matters with respect to what? The claim that I'm making, and the claim that is necessary in order to make the claim that trans women are women, isn't that gender matters more than sex, but rather that it makes more sense to define the term woman in terms of gender rather than defining it in terms of sex, because we get more utility from doing that. That's a completely different claim than talking about what's more real or what matters more between gender and sex. I also don't like the underlying implication that he's like, oh, well, if it's just a social construct, why should it have meaning? Why should it matter? This is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what a social construct is that right-wingers engage in all the time. So a social construct just means that something has meaning because we as a society have decided to give it meaning. So, for example, money is a social construct, but the fact that money is a social construct does not mean that money doesn't matter, that money doesn't have weight. It doesn't mean that when the 2008 financial crash happened, a fuck ton of people killed themselves because of how much money matters. Something can be a social construct and still have a massive amount of importance and weight.
And sex, which is actual real biology. And why is gender more real than biology itself? Why would anyone need to change his or her body in order to align with gender, a social construction, when gender and sex are completely separate in the first place?
I just love listening to like the dramatic music while Ben talks all authoritatively, just saying complete fucking nonsense. So the problem here, okay, why, if gender and sex are totally different, then why do some people change their aspects of their biological sex on account of their gender? Well, the reason is because we as a society associate certain biological characteristics with certain genders. And because trans people want to be recognized as the gender that they identify with, they change their certain biological features such that they fall more under what people recognize as the gender they identify as. Now, again, the fundamental misunderstanding that he's engaging in here is that he's making an argument that gender and sex sometimes overlap, but nobody's really disputing that. And in order to say that trans women are women and that trans men are men, we don't have to say that gender and sex as concepts never overlap with one another. They certainly do. We just have to claim that these two concepts are distinct, right? They are different things, which sometimes overlap, but you can still have a gender that doesn't align with your sex. That is still possible. And again, Ben Shapiro hasn't made a single argument against that position.
Gender dysphoria, which is what we're talking about here, is a serious and tragic disorder. It is also extremely rare. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, those who had received a diagnosis of gender identity disorder or transsexualism and were seeking hormone treatment and or surgery represented just 0.005 to 0.014% for males and 0.002 to 0.003% for females. Those stats are now rising dramatically.
We have that big announcement.
Well, why are they rising, Ben? Because it seems like the underlying implication is that they're rising because like somehow people, like children, because of trans ideology who otherwise wouldn't have been trans, are somehow being coerced into saying that they're trans or tricked into saying that they're trans. But there's really no evidence of this at all. There was that one study which made this claim or claimed to support this, called it was the Lisa Littman study, about rapid onset gender dysphoria, but that study was like hilariously fucking bad. It was so bad that it got retracted by the university that published it, and she, I think, got fired because of how bad that study was. So there's no evidence of this at all. And in fact, if this were the case, then we wouldn't see desistance rates, right? Like rates of people who start transitioning and then go back on it being so incredibly fucking low, right? So a more simple explanation of the skyrocketing rates of people identifying as trans, which is more in line with the existing empirical research, would say that more people are identifying as trans not because they're being tricked into thinking they're trans, but because society is becoming more accepting and they feel more comfortable coming out and expressing how they feel.
From an Oscar-nominated actor announcing he is transgender. Elliot Page came out publicly with a post about his identity.
And in that post, now liked nearly 2.5 million times, the more I hold myself close and fully embrace who I am, the more I dream, the more my heart grows, and the more I thrive. And guys, that's what we love to see.
Yes, he is going to help so many. Janae, thank you so much.
People suffering from gender dysphoria, which, in its non-politicized definition, means the persistent belief that you are a member of the opposite sex.
I love that he says, like, in its non-politicized definition, and then just gives the wrong definition. If you wanted to give the non-politicized definition, you would appeal to the definition which is used by the DSM, which is the manual which defines mental illnesses, which you even cited earlier in this video, right? And according to that definition, it's not just the belief that you are the opposite sex. It is the condition of having significant psychological significant problems with your psychological functioning as a product of the misalignment of your gender identity and your assigned sex at birth. So yeah, that part of it's wrong. Also, just the idea that like we define it in terms of you believe you're the opposite sex. Trans people don't believe that they're the opposite sex, right? If trans people believed that they were the opposite sex, why would so many trans people get bottom surgery, right? Like, why get bottom surgery to have a vagina if you think you already have a vagina, right? Like, trans people don't believe that they have boobs and a vagina and XX chromosomes. What they believe correctly is that their gender identity and their preferred gender expression does not coincide with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Again, very different claim. I feel like I've had to correct this like 30,000 fucking times.
Have a tragically high suicidal ideation and depression rate. That suicidal ideation rate remains tragically high after surgical and hormonal treatment. Longitudinal studies that are good just do not exist on the efficacy of these measures. And the mental health problems associated with gender dysphoria remain extremely damaging, even in particularly accepting societies. But stuff.
All right, so there's a few problems here. So first he says there's no good longitudinal studies on the issue of the efficacy of transitioning. And this is actually true, right? So I'll explain why. So in the medical field, the golden standard study for evaluating a given medical treatment is a double-blind controlled study. However, you can't run these types of studies on the efficacy of transitioning for two major reasons. The first reason is that in order to have a double-blind controlled study, one of those groups, or the control group, has to be receiving a placebo. There is no placebo for transitioning, right? You know, it is very apparent whether or not you have breasts or whether or not you have a vagina or a penis or whether or not you're on HRT, right? There's no possible placebo because the effects are very physically apparent of whether or not you're actually receiving the medication or the treatment. The second problem is that having a proper control group with regards to the efficacy of transitioning would require that you take a group of properly diagnosed trans people who meet the requirements for gender transitioning and you split them into two groups. One of these groups receives transitioning and one of these groups is prevented from receiving transitioning. However, withholding a beneficial treatment from the latter group would be highly unethical and therefore would never be approved to run a study like that. But the problem is, just because we don't have a perfect study, that doesn't mean we just forego a conclusion, right? We have medical treatments which are approved all of the time, which you can't run these kinds of ideal studies on, right? In general, the way that data is analyzed in academia is that if you have an issue where you can't run a perfect study, but you have a certain imperfect methodologies that you can run, and all of the studies you've done on the imperfect methodologies or with the imperfect methodologies tend to suggest a certain conclusion. What you do is you say, okay, this seems to be the conclusion that all of the evidence is pointing to. However, there's further research on this issue would be preferable, right? And so with regards to the issue of gender transitioning, what kinds of studies, what kinds of methodologies do we have, and what is the conclusion? Well, there's three major types of methodologies we can use. You can measure the quality of life of a group of trans people before and after transitioning. You can measure the quality of life of a group of trans people after transitioning and compare it to the general quality of life of trans people before transitioning. or you can do like surveys and interviews and such and just ask trans people if they feel better in terms of their quality of life after transitioning than they did before. Now, again, these studies aren't perfect, but it's what we have to work with. So what do studies which utilize these three basic methodologies tend to suggest? Well, this 1990 meta-analysis of 11 studies found that transitioning is effective. This 2007 meta-analysis of 18 studies found that transitioning is effective. This 2018 meta-analysis of 29 studies found that transitioning is effective. This 2010 meta-analysis of 28 studies found that transitioning is effective. This Cornell University analysis of 55 studies found that 93% of the studies analyzed found that transitioning is effective, and then 7% of the studies reported mixed or null findings, and 0% reported that transitioning harms trans people. This 2016 meta-analysis examining 38 studies found that transitioning is beneficial. So it seems like there's a pretty wide consensus that this is what the evidence currently points to. There was another methodology that was used in this 2019 Swedish total population study, where basically what the researchers did was they looked at trans people using medical records from Sweden, and they tried to evaluate whether or not time since initiation of transitioning was related to the likelihood of seeking mental health treatment in 2015, right? Because obviously, if you sought mental health treatment in 2015, that's like a proxy for like you are having issues with your mental health. And again, what this study found was that gender transitioning does increase the well-being of trans people and is a valid treatment which should be pursued. Basically, this is what all the current evidence points to. Now, another thing he said was that, even after surgery, rates of mental illness and suicide rates remain high. But again, this is in a different way, not how you analyze data with regards to the efficacy of medical treatments. When you're analyzing whether or not we should use a certain medical treatment, we don't say, does this solve all of your problems? And if it doesn't, then we just throw it in the trash. No, that would be absurd. We say, does this seem to relieve certain symptoms such that undergoing this treatment is generally beneficial? And if it does, and if it is, then it's greenlit. And if there's no side effects that overwhelm the general positive effects. And then it's just considered a valid treatment. And so like we wouldn't expect trans people after transitioning to have comparable levels of mental health compared to the general population, because trans people, even after they've transitioned, still face a variety of problems. Trans people still might face issues where they're not accepted by their families, or they're not accepted by their friends, or they face certain like levels of systemic discrimination in areas like medical treatment or healthcare provision and things like that. Or maybe they have certain internalized transphobic narratives because we live in a culture with generally negative attitudes towards trans people. There's a variety of problems. But the fact that other problems don't exist doesn't mean that transitioning doesn't help or shouldn't be pursued by trans people. It just means that in addition to allowing trans people to transition, we should also push for more things such as higher acceptance of trans people to alleviate the other issues as well. Another thing he said was that even in countries where acceptance of trans people is high, they still have higher suicide rates. Well, I would need to know what he means by countries where acceptance is high, because the only way to say that is we can talk about countries where acceptance of trans people is high relative to other countries, but that doesn't mean that those countries don't still have a lot of like general transphobia, which still has a negative impact on the well-being of trans people and causes a disparity in mental health and suicide, right? For example, America is relatively progressive towards trans people, a lot more progressive than like countries you'll find in the Middle East, for example. But that doesn't mean we still don't have substantial percentages of the population where people just don't accept of trans people, or trans people are discriminated in certain areas like healthcare. You would be hard-pressed to find a single country with no stigma or like no negative attitudes towards trans people, which could account for a mental health disparity. But a more intelligent way of asking the question of what effect acceptance has on trans suicides, rather than Ben's weird accepting country analysis, is to run actual studies, right, or look at actual data on the subject. Okay, so the way that you run studies on the association between stigma and acceptance and mental health outcomes for trans people is, again, they're imperfect studies, but it's the data we have to work with right now. And again, we don't forego conclusions just because we don't have perfect data. Basically what you do is you survey a bunch of trans people or run detailed interviews with a bunch of trans people. You collect data on certain things they've experienced and certain psychological outcomes, like have you attempted suicide, do you suffer from depression, etc. And then you run some statistical analysis, like regression analysis or something, in order to determine which experiences and which factors are associated with which outcomes, right? And when you do this, what you find pretty consistently is that stigma and lack of acceptance of trans people is a significant driver of trans people's poor mental health, and B, when this issue is corrected, the mental health of trans people is improved significantly. So, for example, this was a 2016 study published in The Lancet, which found that the distress, impairment, and frequency of mental illness within the trans community, within the trans population, primarily arises in response to discrimination, stigma, lack of acceptance, abuse, etc., and that the authors of the study claimed that their findings lend support to the notion that being trans is not in and of itself a mental disorder. This was a 2015 study published in the Miliband Quarterly, which found that over 60% of trans people studied experienced discrimination in the context of public accommodations, and about 25% experienced discrimination related to healthcare, which researchers found to be linked with up to an 81% increase in adverse emotional symptoms. There's a few other interesting studies over here, like this one, which surveyed 433 trans youth and found that the attempted suicide rate among those whose parents were somewhat to not at all supportive was 57%, and among kids whose parents were very supportive, the suicide rate dropped to 4%. A similar study here finds that trans people whose chosen names were used compared to those whose chosen names were not used experienced a 71% drop in severe depression, a 34% drop in suicidal ideation, and a 67% drop in suicide attempts. Yeah, this seems like pretty concrete. Also, this study, 2016 study from Pediatrics, finds that transgender youth whose families, friends, and teachers were accepting of their gender identity had equivalent levels of depression and only marginally higher levels of anxiety compared to the general population. So, according to all of this data, all of these studies, all of these meta-analyses, if we are concerned with bettering the lives of trans people, the path is clear. We allow them to transition, provide them resources to help them transition, and we push for higher acceptance of them, and we recognize them as the gender that they were identified as. The only alternative approach that I can think of would be just like conversion therapy or trying to detrans them, which just empirically doesn't work. Every study that's ever been done on conversion therapy for trans people has found that 1, it doesn't work, and 2, it significantly psychologically harms the people who are placed in it.
Suffering from a mental disorder does not change your underlying sex any more than believing that you are Napoleon Bonaparte makes you Napoleon Bonaparte.
Again, so I'm going to make this correction for like the 3,000th time. Trans people do not believe that because they have this mental disorder, that changes their physical sex, right? No trans person believes that because they have gender dysphoria, they physically have manifested a vagina out of a penis, right? Like by the power of their brains. Like this just doesn't exist. The claim isn't that they can change, that their sex is different. The claim is that their gender identity doesn't coincide with that sex.
Transgender activists make an objective claim about reality based on subjective internal feelings. That's unsustainable. What's more, transgender...
that doesn't make any sense. Like, if we're defining gender in terms of expression and internal identity, then yes, how a person subjectively feels that they identify and would like to express themselves is going to determine whether or not they were a woman. This would be like if somebody came over to my house and they said, yeah, I'm a big Packers fan. You know, like Packers, I think it's the Packers, like Wisconsin football team. And then I were to be like, whoa, so you think so you're making the objective claim that you are a Packers fan based on the internal subjective feeling that you're a Packers fan? That doesn't make any sense. That's unsustainable. Like, this is absurd.
Gender activists demand that you abandon reason, biology, privacy, even the ability to raise your kids in concert with reality in favor of a delusional quasi-religious worldview in which gender and sex are completely segregated and a boy can be a girl and a girl a boy.
He's just playing the hits here. I've already addressed all this, so. The song is pretty good, TBH.
Now, none of this means that anybody suffering from gender dysphoria ought to be mistreated.
They shouldn't be mistreated. We should just, coming from the guy who says that we shouldn't recognize them as the gender that they identify as, which is like a key predictor of poor mental health in trans people. Like, do you not think that's mistreating them?
Anybody with any sort of disorder ought to be treated with nothing but sympathy and care. But this does mean that a society that seeks to propagandize...
Also, the claim he's making that all trans people suffer from a disorder is just factually not true. Being trans is not a mental disorder according to the DSM, which determines what's a mental disorder. Now, it is possible a lot of trans people have gender dysphoria, which is a mental disorder, which means that you are suffering significant psychological harm as a result of the non-correspondence between your gender identity and your assigned sex at birth. However, not all trans people have gender dysphoria, because if you're trans, that just means that your gender identity does not align with your sex that you were assigned at birth. That doesn't necessarily entail that you're suffering significant psychological harm as a product of that. So no, not all trans people. Being trans isn't a mental illness. Not all trans people have a mental illness, by definition.
To children that they can switch their gender is both lying to kids and doing them psychological harm in the process.
Right. Well, as I explained earlier, if we want to talk about psychological harm with regards to the trans issue, the path which has been empirically proven time and time again to increase the psychological health of trans people is to recognize them as the gender that they identify as, allow them to transition, be accepting, etc. But this is the opposite of what you advocate for, so I don't know why he would play the, oh, you're psychologically harming people card.
Unfortunately, that's exactly what our society is now teaching kids in public schools. Anti-biological nonsense, including the lie that you might just be a different gender with different pronouns. And it's not just that. With the new Equality Act,
the motion is adopted.
The Biden administration and the Democratic Party are seeking to promote the idea that any institution that doesn't mimic these lies has to be destroyed. Religious institutions are not exempted from federal regulations that demand that men...
Wait. Can Ben show me where in, like, the Equality Act it says that churches who aren't accepting of trans people should be destroyed? Because that simply doesn't exist in the legislation. But if anyone here wants to defend Ben, feel free to find me a quote to that effect.
Men who identify as women be treated as women. And this is true in sports, in restrooms. Ironically, feminists who...
Alright, so sports and restrooms. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about the public accommodations thing first. Because it's a lot simpler. So the idea here is that we shouldn't allow, trans people to go in bathrooms that align with the gender that they identify as, because doing so would lead to all sorts of problems. It might lead to, sexual assault or sexual harassment, where trans women are going in to, like, creep on little girls or whatever. But But the problem is this just doesn't make any logical sense, and it's also not backed by any empirical evidence. So to start with the logical aspect, why would somebody have committed themselves to a crime like I'm going to sexually harass someone, or I'm going to sexually assault someone even, which is a crime which they're going to face penalties for, but then after had already deciding they wanted to commit that crime, they would be deterred by another law which carries a less severe penalty that says that you can't go into a bathroom unless you're like a biological female, right? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, oh yes, I've decided I'm going to go in and sexually harass someone, which carries a 5-year sentence. However, I just found out that there's these bathroom laws that carry a less severe penalty, and I'm going to get a $100 fine if I go in the wrong bathroom, and now I'm too scared to do it. Like, it's stupid. Now to the empirical evidence, right? So this one 2018 study published in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law searched numerous archives, and despite doing so, the authors find no evidence that trans-inclusive bathroom laws led to an increase in sexual assaults. This more detailed 2019 study published in Sexuality Research and Social Policy found that the passage of gender identity inclusive public non-discrimination ordinances are not related to the number or frequency of criminal incidents in locker rooms, restrooms, and dressing rooms. In addition to those studies, CNN reached out to 20 law enforcement agencies in states with anti-discrimination policies covering gender identity, and none of the law enforcement agencies who answered reported any bathroom assaults after the policies took effect. Media Matters reached out to 15 experts with knowledge of rates of sexual assault in 12 different states with trans non-discrimination policies to ask if they'd seen an increase in these kinds of crimes as a result of the anti-discrimination policies, and every single expert that responded said that they'd observed no increase in these kinds of crimes as a result of non-discrimination legislation. Media Matters also reached out to 17 school districts, collectively covering more than 600,000 students, which have non-discrimination rules for trans people, to ask if these policies had led to an increase in problems with harassment, and every single school district that responded said they have seen no such problems as a result of non-discrimination rules. So there's just no logic or empirical evidence to suggest that the problem Ben is alluding to is actually a problem that exists. However, there was a 2019 study published in Pediatrics, which found that trans youth whose restroom and locker room usage are restricted face higher rates of sexual assault. So it's not trans-inclusive non-discrimination laws that increase sexual harassment and assault, but the lack of them do cause sexual assault for trans people. So if we care about diminishing the number of sexual assaults, then the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that we want to pass these non-discrimination laws. Now, when it comes to the sports things, there's a few different layers. The sports thing, that trans people competing in sports is going to cause problems and it's going to be unfair, etc. There's a few layers to this. The first is that, I'll talk about what we do know, and then I'll talk about what we don't know. So we do know that men in general have a substantial physiological athletic advantage over women. We also know that these athletic physiological differences are primarily a product of the fact that men have testosterone and women have estrogen. So for example, men having more testosterone increases their red blood cell production, increases their lung capacity, increases their percentage of fat-free mass, etc. Now, we also know that when trans women take HRT and start, taking estrogen, their physiological advantage over cis women drops substantially, right? Women get significantly weaker, or trans women get significantly weaker and less physically able when they start taking estrogen. Now, what we don't know, and people will claim that we do know this both on the left and on the right, but trust me, okay? I'm the only one who is going to tell you the truth about this. If you've ever listened to anyone talk about this and they don't tell you what I'm about to tell you, they are lying, okay? What we don't know is whether or not taking HRT as a trans woman is sufficient to reduce the physiological advantage that a trans woman would have over cis women, such that they're on a relatively even playing field. We just don't have any good studies on this. All of the studies we have on this issue have like sample sizes of like 10 people, which is wildly insufficient. There's only like 10 studies on this that I even know of, and they're all terrible quality. This is an open empirical question. So then the question is, given that this is an open empirical question, should we discriminate against trans people? Should we prevent them from competing in women's sports or competing with other cis women? And I would say the answer to that is no, for two reasons. The first reason is that whether or not they have an advantage, we know that even if they do have an advantage, trans women that is, it is not causing any substantial problems that we can observe. So trans women, we can look at where trans women have long been able to compete with cis women, right? Trans women for a very long time have been able to compete with cis women in the Olympics. Has there ever been a trans woman Olympian? No, there has not. The NCAA has long allowed trans women to compete with cis women. Is there some epidemic of trans women dominating these divisions? No, there is not. In fact, despite, I think, an estimated over like 100 trans women competing in the NCAA, there has been exactly one trans woman who has won any sort of championship or anything like that in all of the NCAA. And even that was in Division II, which isn't even the top division. In the top division of the NCAA, there has never been a single trans person to win any sort of championship or anything like that. Even at the high school level, so that was with regards to college sports. Now, even at the high school level, there was a recent Associated Press article where the Associated Press emailed or asked like 24 Republican lawmakers who were trying to pass anti-trans athlete legislation in their respective states. And they asked all of these politicians, can you name us a single example of a trans athlete in your state dominating the competition or causing some sorts of problems in this respect? And the answer from every single one of these politicians was, no, we cannot. The people who responded tried to be like, we can't name one, but we're doing this to prevent successful trans athletes in the future, even though they're already allowed to compete and aren't being very successful, right? So what I'm getting at here is that regardless of whether or not trans people have an athletic advantage, the idea that we ought to pass legislation which further marginalizes and stigmatizes and discriminates against a group of people to combat a problem which we cannot even observe as an existing problem, that sounds absurd to me. I would reject anybody who would propose that we do that. Now, the second reason that I would say we shouldn't discriminate against trans people is that, so there was this paper that I found interesting. This was a 2019 paper published in the Journal of Medical Ethics, which asserts that while there may be an intolerable advantage for trans people or for trans women in women's sports, the solution is not to discriminate against trans women, but rather to abandon the sex-based binary male-female division in sports altogether. So to read from a quote, the performance advantage likely held by trans women is not a tolerable unfairness. This is not an attempt to exclude trans women from elite sport. Instead, we concluded that it is important to both extend and celebrate diversity while maintaining fairness for cis women in sport. To be simultaneously inclusive and fair at the elite level, the male-female binary must be discarded in favor of a more nuanced approach. We conclude that the gender binary in sport has perhaps had its day. So let me give an example of what's being talked about here. So let's say, for example, trans women have an advantage over cis women in racing because trans women have a higher level of hemoglobin in the blood on average. The solution to that isn't to say no trans women can race with any cis woman, but rather to say that we are now going to create these separate divisions where the people that you are able to compete against is based on people who have comparative or relatively comparable levels of this certain relevant physical trait, like hemoglobin levels in the blood, right? And this not only is a more preferable approach in that it doesn't require discriminating against trans people, but also it is just more fair, right? Even if that's your sole concern. Because discriminating against trans people solves that problem, but it doesn't solve the problem that inevitably there are still going to be cis women who have abnormally high levels of, say, hemoglobin in the blood, and therefore them competing with other cis women, that's an unfairness. But creating divisions along the lines of your certain levels with respect to the relevant physical trait would solve that unfairness as well. And so using this approach would be non-discriminatory, more fair, it would make more sense. So why would we discriminate against trans people?
Sought to protect women from men have now seen female spaces completely destroyed because they can't define female and male properly. Most shockingly, we're now a society that demands that parents hand over their kids to the tender mercies of political actors masquerading as medical specialists. If you have a 12-year-old at school with a headache, the school nurse cannot prescribe to them Tylenol without calling you first. But we now have officials in states and in the federal government suggesting that if a 12-year-old says that she is a boy, the school should be able to prescribe puberty blockers without calling a parent. That is a sick society. In the end, a man claiming to be a woman is making an unsustainable claim. He can't even know what it is like to be a woman because he is not one. A man with surgeries.
Okay, so this is an argument that I've heard, what's his name, Matt Walsh make on the Daily Wire YouTube channel, where he basically says, like, you say that you're a woman because you feel like a woman. Yeah, like you say you're a woman because you feel like a woman. And yet, how could you feel like a woman if you are not a woman? See, it's a circular logic. It doesn't make sense. The problem with that is that there is no way to feel like a woman. There is no universal feeling that all women have that having that feeling defines you as a woman, right? This universal feeling doesn't exist. So what trans people mean when they say they feel like a woman is not that they have that feeling, that universal feeling, but rather that they feel inside that the gender that they prefer to identify as and express themselves as is woman, right? Which is a very different claim than what Ben is trying to frame it as.
And hormone treatment does not become a woman, nor does a man who simply declares himself a woman. All of this is insane propaganda and is being propagated for political purposes. So, no, a man cannot become a woman or a woman a man.
Wow, good one. All right. Guess that's the end. That was incredibly frustrating. I hope that wasn't too... I hope this video wasn't too, like, repetitive, because, like, I feel like I had to make the same points repeatedly, like, throughout the video, because he just kept making these weird, like, conflations of saying, like, oh, you're trans, that means you think you're a different sex, or, you know, things like that. So I hope this wasn't too, like, tedious or repetitive. This video is very frustrating for me just because of how much wrong shit he said. But hopefully going over it could be informative for some people. All right. Now that we're at the end of the video, I'm going to give an obligatory shout out to all of my $10 patrons, that being Alex, Daniel, Benny, Isocratic, Liam the Commie, Hate Corruption, CEO of Market Socialism, Zero, Raven, and other Alex. If you are interested in supporting me, then if you're interested in A, supporting me, and B, receiving semi-frequent essays that I sometimes write, about the same kinds of subjects that I talk about on this channel, then I'll link my Patreon in the description, and you can go subscribe to that if you want.